Hi friends. So a couple months ago, I put out a video where I ranked every game in the East series from my least to most favorite. Most favorite? Is that even grammatically correct? Anyway, recently I noticed that videos gained a couple thousand views in a very short time, which I think is wild considering it's a video I mostly edited in my spare time while I was flying on a plane. In any case, I'm glad you guys like it, because I've got another one for you today. A few weeks ago, I beat Trails into Reverie, which means I've officially played every one of the Trails games legally available in English. And so, in celebration of that milestone, I thought I'd do a ranking of that series, just like I did for Ys. Now, before we start, I want to lay out a few ground rules. Those of you who have seen my Ys countdown will know what's coming, since I'm mostly carrying them over from that video, with a few minor alterations. First, and most importantly, this is going to be a spoiler-free countdown. I understand how difficult a proposition that is, considering how important the story is to this series, but the last thing I want to happen is for me to ruin the surprises of what I consider to be one of the greatest ongoing narratives in the entire history of video games. Second, I'm only going to be ranking the games that are currently legally available in English, meaning everything from Sky FC to Reverie. I know that if I wanted to, I could play the Kuro games in English using the magic of the internet, but I'm choosing to wait for the official translations, despite how painful the wait inevitably is going to be. And third, every single game on this list is worth playing, even those ranked near the bottom. Those games aren't bad by any means, they're simply the ones I had the most issues with. Alright, now that that's out of the way, let's start the countdown. I don't think this one is going to be a shock to most people. In my experience, Cold Steel is most fans' least favorite of the series. There are a few different reasons for this. The first, and the one I hear discussed most often, is the fact that the main cast is too large for its own good. In comparison, the Crossbell games retained a small cast throughout, while the Sky games started with a small cast and only gradually expanded it as time went on. In Cold Steel, you're introduced to 10 main characters basically from the start. There's no way, even with a game of this size, that adequate time can be paid to each of them. Further, as has been pointed out by others before me, most of the time we see these characters, they're interacting with Reen at the expense of everyone else. As such, it takes a while before Class 7 feels like an organic unit in the same way as, say, the Special Support section did in the Crossbell games. But it's more than just the bloated roster. Cold Steel, at least for me, feels like it was borrowing a lot from Persona. There's the school setting, there's the fact that the story is structured by the passing of days on a calendar, there's exams you have to take, there's bonding events that are essentially substituting for social links. Persona's fingerprints are all over this game, and while you'd think this would be a good thing, given that I'm a big fan of the Persona series, it really didn't work for me here. Persona went all in on these mechanics. It's one of the few games I can think of that makes the simple act of choosing what to do in your free time both fun and meaningful. Cold Steel, obviously, did not go as far, and as such, their addition just felt superficial and unnecessary. One more issue I have, and this might sound weird, concerns the in-game character models. I don't think they're bad, but at the same time, this was the first Trails game in 3D, and one of the first few 3D Falcom games in general. Obviously, they weren't fully used to 3D development yet, and in Cold Steel's case, it manifests in character models that, especially when compared to their counterparts in Cold Steel 3 and 4, look off to me. The word I've always used to describe them is squishy. Like, compare Reen in this game with how he looks in Cold Steel 3, and hopefully you understand what I mean. Now, I realize that I've been excessively negative thus far, so please don't misunderstand. I may have a fair bit of issues with this game, but I still really enjoyed it. The characters, while perhaps stifled in their initial development by their sheer number, are for the most part memorable and likable. And I love Erebonia as a setting. The regional variation is exceptionally well done, and it's got over 1,000 years of history to explore. And that's mostly what you're going to be doing in this game, going around Erebonia, getting to know the country and its problems. I know some fans think the pace is too slow. It's the most common complaint for any introductory game in each new Trails arc, but as someone who clearly enjoys world building, spending extra time in what's arguably the most successfully built world in video games has never bothered me. Aside from that, the battle system is fun, as it always is, the music is phenomenal. Really, there's a lot to enjoy about this game, despite its obvious problems. The fact that Sky the Third is ranked 9th on my list shows how highly I hold this series in esteem, as there's so much about this game that I absolutely love. However, there's one major factor that brings it down, and anyone who's played it knows what I'm talking about. Sky the Third is primarily a dungeon crawler. Most of your time is spent exploring deeper and deeper into the mysterious realm of Phantasma. There are times when you get to walk around Liberl like in the other Sky games, but these are only facsimiles of Liberl, without any of the NPC interactions the series is known for. This was really hard for me to get used to. I wouldn't argue that the game is actively leaning into its weaknesses, but I would say that it's actively leaning away from some of its strengths. Despite this, I absolutely recommend this game because it arguably has the strongest character writing in the entire series. The main story is basically a deep dive into the psychology of Kevin Graham, a character we first got to know in Sky SC, but only at a distance. Here, the focus is primarily on him, and without giving anything away, oh my god, he is a mess. Aside from this A-plot, we're also treated to a cornucopia of bonus content in the form of the game's door mechanic. Some of these doors are simple side quests, like mini-games or bonus bosses, but a number are additional scenes that shed light on the characters or the world's lore. I absolutely love these scenes, with some of them being among the most powerful moments in Trails. All I have to say is Star Door 15, and anyone who's finished the game will know exactly what I'm talking about. I've heard some fans suggest you can just skip over Sky the Third, but I couldn't disagree with that sentiment more. A significant amount of the bonus content provides momentous foreshadowing for the next two arcs, and again, skipping the game deprives you of some of the best writing, not just in Trails, but in RPGs as a whole. It's for that reason that, despite my issues with its gameplay, and how relatively low the game is ranked overall, I still consider it absolutely essential for any Trails fan to finish at least once. The second entry in the Cold Steel arc makes a number of improvements to its predecessor. Structurally, the game abandons the Persona-like adherence to following a school calendar, and mostly focuses on Reen's attempts to reunite with his classmates and do what they can to intervene in the ongoing Civil War. This made the game, at least to me, a lot less of a slog to get through. Furthermore, the battle system was given a major addition with the advent of Divine Night battles. The system is, admittedly, rather simple, with emphasis mostly focusing on discovering and exploiting enemy weak points, but I've always thought it to be fun in spite of its simplicity, and what can I say, I'm a sucker for any game that lets you battle in a giant robot. Unfortunately, I feel the game has some pacing issues, especially near the end. I don't think the ending is bad or anything, in fact I think most of what happens is great, but the way it's structured can make it feel like the game doesn't know where it wants to end, which serves to lessen the emotional impact of that finale. Also, I have to knock the game for the unpardonable sin of locking what turns out to be essential plot details behind a New Game Plus paywall. I'm talking about the revelations concerning the Black Records here, which are in fact essential to the understanding of the entire Erebonia arc going forward. The idea of forcing someone to play through an 80-plus hour-long RPG twice in order to experience critical lore is such a stupid decision. Coming in at number 7 is the game that started it all. Now, some of you might be surprised by this, as I tend to see Sky FC ranked close to the bottom of a lot of fan rankings, because a lot of people find it unforgivingly slow. Technically, every first entry in each new Trails arc tends to be slow, but Sky FC gets the most flack out of any of them. And yeah, the game is very slow, but I've never been as bothered by it as others have. For one, you're playing as Estelle and Joshua at the very beginning of their journeys as bracers. Their jobs are obviously going to start small. Related to that, this is more or less the first time the two of them are exploring any part of the world outside their little corner of Roland, and this situation directly mirrors that of the player, as this game is more than likely going to be their first experience in the world of Trails. The story of this series was planned to last decades. Immediately being thrown into the weeds would be narrative suicide. As the introductory entry for the series as a whole, the story feels a lot lower stakes than most of the others in the series. Ouroboros is nowhere in sight, you're not fighting enemies that rival the strength of gods, you're basically just solving Liberl's domestic issues, and again, I'm just fine with this. It feels like what a first entry should be, and has a mostly relaxing atmosphere that I find unique to this entry in particular. Really, the only reason why I'm ranking this game where it is isn't because of any glaring faults, it's mostly because I happen to think the other games are just better in different ways. If you think the story is too slow, stick with it. It does ramp up quite a bit near the end, and that cliffhanger ending is one of the best in any video game I've ever played. I've mentioned it before, but I bought the other two Sky games immediately after the credits rolled because it was just that compelling. If you get to the end, I guarantee you're going to want to play the other 9 games right away, like I did. I've been waiting to play Trails into Reverie for over 2 years, and now that I've played it, I found it a really solid game, ranking almost directly in the middle of my overall series ranking. The main reason for this is a simple one. There was no reason for the game to be as long as it was. Don't get me wrong, I really enjoyed the main story, and almost all the side content, but throughout a huge chunk of my playthrough, I couldn't help but think that Falcom could have told the story in about half the time if they wanted to. If I were on the development team, I would have suggested to make Reverie not as a full game, but as a half-length, half-price DLC epilogue to Cold Steel 4, similar to what Monolith Soft did with Xenoblade 3 and Future Redeemed. Choosing to make it a full-length Trails game required them to fill it with excessive padding and an unnecessarily large scope. This was most evident in the final act. It's obvious that Falcom was trying really hard to give it a huge ending, but there was just no way it would be able to measure up to that of Cold Steel 4. Making the game a DLC epilogue instead of a standalone entry would have, I feel, alleviated this pressure to one-up Cold Steel 4's ending as they did. Aside from that one flaw, the rest of it was great. Basically, it's Sky the Third, but done better. The dungeon crawling is back in the form of the true Reverie corridor, but this time it acts as a supplement rather than the main focus. Most of your time is going to be spent exploring Crossbell. All the bonus content makes a return as well. Some of it directly lifted from Sky the Third, some taken from Cold Steel, and some brand new. And almost all of it is a lot of fun. The only one I didn't really enjoy is Project Tearfang, because I just found it to be too clunky for my taste. And of course, there's still plenty of extra scenarios to experience, which, like in Sky the Third, both serve as a send-off to your characters and sets up the upcoming Calvert arc. Despite my issues with its unnecessary length, I still put an ungodly amount of hours into playing this game, and I technically still haven't done all of the post-game content yet. As far as both value and enjoyment for your money, it's hard to find a better deal than Trails into Reverie. Trails from Zero is the first game in the Crossbell duology, and the introduction to the state of Crossbell as a whole. Many fans consider these two games to be the high point of the entire series, and playing Trails from Zero, it isn't hard to see why. Taking control of the Crossbell Police Department's newly formed Special Support Section, your task is to try and assist the citizens of the state with their issues, while at the same time trying to navigate your way around the myriad issues crippling Crossbell as a state. And exploring Crossbell is undoubtedly the high point of this arc. It's a much smaller setting than either Liberl or Erebonia, but what it sacrifices in sheer surface area, it more than makes up for in sheer depth. By the time you're finished, you're going to know Crossbell and its surrounding suburbs just as well as you do the town where you actually live in. Related to this reduction in scope is the size of the main cast. The Special Support Section consists of only 4 playable characters, and because it's a small group, that means the game has that much more time to devote to them in depth. Trails from Zero is almost the polar opposite of the original Cold Steel in that respect. No need to worry about any failures to establish rapport for the main cast here. And that's great, because the SSS is a fantastic group of protagonists. As far as the main plot is concerned, Zero is perhaps the most standalone game in the entire series. There are some important callbacks to the Sky arc, primarily in the returns of Estelle, Joshua, and Ren, which makes it advisable that you finish that arc before starting this one, but aside from that, a lot of it is a self-contained crime tale. And as with any good crime tale, there's plenty of mystery and detection to be had. In all, this is another game that's only ranked where it is because I happen to like the other games ahead of it more, not due to any glaring faults of its own. There's a reason why it was such a huge deal when this game, as well as its companion, Trails to Azure, were announced for a legitimate English language release. It's a major triumph among RPGs, and we in the West are lucky to be able to play it legitimately. When I was putting together this countdown, I really struggled on whether Zero or Cold Steel 3 should be ranked number 4. A major reason why Cold Steel 3 ended up winning out is because I see it as a symbol of the series' continued improvement. It seems to me that Falcom really took much of the criticism levied against the first 2 Cold Steel games to heart and did their damnedest to improve upon them. For starters, new Class 7 is much smaller than old Class 7. Aside from Reen, there's only 3 others, and technically we've already met Altina in Cold Steel 2. Ash and Muse round out the cast, but they're introduced later, after the player is given time to acclimate themselves to the other characters first. These new heroes are all great, and owing to their smaller class size, really feel like more of a cohesive unit from the start. The structure of this game, while returning to the school life feel of Cold Steel 1, didn't bother me as much as it did in that game. I'm assuming this is because Reen has become an instructor as opposed to a student, so it doesn't feel so much like it's attempting to ape the mechanics of Persona on a surface level. And though I haven't heard anyone else complain about this as I have, I do appreciate Falcom upgrading the character models beginning in this game. I think they look far better than their Cold Steel 1 and 2 counterparts. Even the battle system gets some improvements, in the form of the additions of the Break Gauge and Brave Orders. These are admittedly rather divisive amongst the fandom, as some believe they make it too easy to break the game, but I've never had a problem with them. Plenty of enemies are still difficult, and personally, I love discovering just how many ways I can fuck up their Christmas by taking advantage of those systems. I know that others are going to disagree with me on that, but for me, these mechanics are a playground, and I had a ton of fun playing. The one real issue I have with the game is with regards to its pacing. Cold Steel 3 apparently has the largest script of any Trails game thus far, and it certainly feels like it at times. Specifically, I feel like the A-plot in the first half of the game can drag a bit more than it should, but once you get to the scene at the Imperial Palace, the story ramps up and just does not stop, and oh my god, that ending. It's gonna hit you like a drop kick to the gut. It's definitely the most despairing ending thus far in Trails, and it'll absolutely make you want to go out and buy Cold Steel 4, if only to give the characters the happy ending they deserve. The last few minutes of Trails in the Sky FC made me realize I wasn't playing just another JRPG series, and Sky's second chapter more than confirmed those expectations. For many fans, Sky SC is an all-time franchise highlight, and it's hard to dispute that, as there's so much to love about this game. Estelle and Joshua both, in their own ways, need to go through hell after the revelations of the previous game. Ouroboros makes their grand entrance onto the stage, recontextualizing everything that had happened up to this point and preparing us for even greater struggles in the future. The story never stops once it picks up, between the main character's struggles and the absolute hell Burl goes through thanks to Ouroboros. It's an exhausting experience, though I mean that in the best sense of that word. The real issue I have, and it's really minor in the grand scheme of things, concerns the boss rush near the end of the game. Now, most Trails games have some sort of boss rush at the end of them, but for most, that boss rush comes in the midst of a labyrinthine final dungeon. Here, you're basically running up a spiral tower and fighting a boss every so often. I think it's because of that monotonous structure that makes it feel like such a slog in this game in particular. But really, the fact that that's the biggest issue I have with the game should speak to how great I think it is. Trails to Azure, much like Sky SC before it, is a game that fires on all cylinders from almost the very beginning. Though it starts a bit slower, once you hit the West Zemuria Trade Conference, it bombards you with just one earth-shattering event after another, culminating in one of the most incredible plot twists in any RPG I've ever played. Aside from that, poor Crossbell, this city just cannot catch a break. It's ravaged by what feels like every faction on the continent. Additionally, the game has some great replay value for Trails veterans. Since Azure basically takes place concurrently with the first 2 Cold Steel games, it's fascinating to witness the events of those games play out from a different perspective. Aside from that, you've got a couple of new party members to play with, a couple of positive tweaks to the battle system. Really, Trails to Azure takes everything that made Zero so great and gives you more, in addition to one of the greatest main narratives in the entire Trails series. The end of the Erebonia arc, and in some ways the culmination of the entire Trails series up to that point, Cold Steel 4 was, for me, a no-brainer when it comes to choosing a favorite. I know that it's another divisive entry. For one thing, I've heard some people criticize the pacing, and that you have all this world-ending stuff happening and your group is able to fly around the country helping people with their problems still. I see where they're coming from, but this was never going to be something that bothered me. Again, my favorite game of all time is Final Fantasy VII, aka the game where, oh shit, meteor's gonna crash into the planet in a week, I guess I better spend 20 hours racing chocobos in the gold saucer. Anyway, for me, what sets Cold Steel at the apex of the Trails pyramid is that it's a beautiful fulfillment of the promise implied by the release of Sky FC. The story of Trails was designed to run long. Indeed, we're almost 2 decades in and we're only a little more than halfway through. To maintain this high standard of quality for nearly 2 decades is a phenomenal achievement, but Trails does it, and Cold Steel 4 is the ultimate example of that achievement. Just about every single narrative thread from the series' history comes to a head here, and as such, the game features a cast of nearly every protagonist from every game up to this point. The more cynical among you would dismiss this as fan service, and while I'm not going to deny that fan service probably plays into it to an extent, there's obviously a lot more going on than just that. Every single character has a reason to be there, a personal stake in the struggle that makes their presence essential. I mean, for God's sakes, there are plot points that were introduced near the beginning of Sky FC that only get fully resolved at the end of Cold Steel 4. Falcom's skill at the storytelling long game is unmatched, rivaled only by the likes of Tetsuya Takahashi among the JRPG contemporaries. And that story, as is a pattern with my favorite Trails games, Cold Steel 4 is a game that starts with a bang and literally does not stop until the credits roll. Even during those moments that other fans complain about, there's still so much going on, especially given this game's enormous cast. The size of the cast, I should say, doesn't bother me here, because at this point, all of them are basically fully established, and their main purpose is to wrap a bow around their respective story arcs, which the game does beautifully. It all culminates in one of the most powerful endings in any game that I've ever played. There's only so much I can say without spoiling it, but to put it simply, it's the video game equivalent to Infinity War. For me, it's more impressive than Infinity War, as instead of using characters that have the benefit of decades and decades worth of comic book continuity behind them, these are characters who have only existed since, at the earliest, 2004. It's almost impossible for me to put into words how incredible I think this ending is, but I think all that needs to be said is, after playing through 9 games to get there, with most stretching to the 80-hour mark, I can honestly say that the journey was more than worth it, and anyone who's even halfway interested in the RPG genre owes it to themselves to play through the entire series, obscene length be damned. Alright, that's my ranking of all the Trails games. I hope you enjoyed it. Now that I'm here, I realize how obscenely hard it was for me to discuss the series without delving into spoilers. Maybe in the future I should do some more Trails-centric videos where I go into deep dives into big-time spoiler-heavy details. There's obviously a ton I could cover there. And for those of you who haven't played the series yet, or maybe just haven't finished it, I hope now you have more of an incentive to do it, as obviously I think the time investment is totally worth it. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys later.